Thank you, everybody. So yeah, I'm Nafees Hamid. I am the Research and Policy Director for this project called Accept, which is based out of King's College London. I'm based at the International Centre for the Study of Radicalization. And Accept is a large multi-partner project. We have partners with Asia Foundation, we're partners with Chatham House. But the KCL, the King's College component of Accept, we're basically a multidisciplinary team of psychologists, social scientists, historians, clinicians, and the basic research question that we're asking is actually quite a broad one, which is what are the pathways to peace and violence? And we're particularly focused on FCAS countries, fragile, conflict-affected states. So our work mostly happens in the Middle East and Africa. And we use a variety of different methods, from longitudinal surveys to experimental design, qualitative interviews. The team overall looks at things from trauma and mental health, to gender, memory, and conflict, trust in institutions, armed actors, and prisons. Today I'm going to be focusing specifically on the trauma and mental health part, but I think what you'll find even throughout the talk is that all of these different themes keep coming up. There's no real way to disentangle them from each other. So trauma, the thing about trauma is we all know that conflict, whether it's war zones or being held in detention centers or being held in IDP or refugee camps, can itself cause trauma. That's usually when you hear people talking about trauma, that's the angle at which they're talking about it. They're saying how these terrible experiences can lead to things like PTSD or other mental health issues. But what we're specifically looking at is whether unhealed trauma can in and of itself be a susceptibility back into political violence. Meaning that if we heal the trauma itself, do we actually increase the chance that these people will be less susceptible to getting pulled into an extremist group, and maybe even more open to peace building, to dialogue, to negotiations, to rehabilitation and reintegration of former militants back into their communities. So that's sort of broadly what we're looking at. Now, there is a clear link between trauma and mental health problems. People oftentimes see these things as two separate issues, but they're not always. So there's a recent trend within clinical psychology looking at something called P factor. P factor is, before we would always look at things like PTSD, depression, psychosis, anxiety, whatever, as being all separate factors, that they had very little relationship to each other. Then we started noticing that there was actually comorbidities here, that there was a lot of correlation, that if you had one, you had a much higher chance of having the other. And then increasingly there's been research showing that perhaps there's one underlying factor that actually cuts across most of these things, which is, we call it a P factor, but it generally represents some form of mental distress. And mental distress seems to be an underlying factor, and it can manifest itself through anxiety and depression and other issues. And I just want to briefly say something about some of these symptoms. And it was based off a conversation I had with Mike yesterday, so hopefully I won't be jumping the gun on your talk. But there is a difference between experiencing something on the low end of some of these mental health or trauma symptoms and experiencing something on the very high end. Anxiousness is not the same thing as full-blown anxiety, right? Anxiousness itself can actually probably be maybe even a good thing, right? You're anxious on a first date, you're anxious at a job interview, it's preparing you, it's mentally getting you ready for this task that you have ahead of you. People with full-blown anxiety sometimes can't leave the home to go do their grocery shopping because they'll have a panic attack as soon as they walk into the grocery store, because they get overwhelmed by the decisions that they have to make in that particular moment. So it's when something crosses over into that extreme end of mental health issues that we think that there's potentially a problem for getting pulled into extremist groups. And we know that there's a strong relationship between mental health and trauma and joining extremist groups. We know it's particularly high amongst lone actor extremists. Some studies have shown that it's almost 14 times, you're almost 14 times as likely to find someone with a variety of different mental health issues inside a terrorist group or an extremist group than you are in the general, compared to group actors in the same terrorist group. So we know that there's a very high rate of mental health issues amongst lone actors. They also spend a lot of time on the internet. It's very high rates in the incel community. You see it also particularly with white nationalists. You see a high rate of autism amongst people who are getting radicalized online, and I'll talk about maybe some explanations for why that's the case. And even, this is some pictures of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. We know that they have a pretty high rate of mental health issues. And some of them even have high rates of PTSD, actually, because many of them had military experience and have PTSD from there. And the thing is, so we already know that there's clearly this link between mental health and PTSD, and I should say there's also a difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, which is where we really find is sort of the insidious kind of PTSD. A lot of PTSD sort of improves over time with just a little bit of effort and a little bit of interventions. Complex PTSD is when people have repeated traumatic events again and again and again. And that's what you see particularly in FCAS countries. People who've been living for years in war zones, who've been living for years in IDP camps and so forth, in detention centers. And it's that complex PTSD that we think has a particularly strong link to violent extremism. Moved on its own. The problem with a lot of the research, though, generally on trauma and mental health and its link to violent extremism is that it's almost entirely cross-sectional research, right? So you just go in, you do one survey in some part of the world, you do some correlational analysis, and then you say, okay, there's a relationship here. But that's not necessarily the best methodology for actually studying these things. So part of what we're doing in our team, and we're just launching this research in 3 countries, in Iraq, Syria, and South Sudan, is we're doing it longitudinally, and we're doing it with a randomized control trial. So we have about 2,000 people in each country. We survey across a variety of different issues, from violent extremist beliefs and susceptibility to those things, and then mental health issues. We follow them over about a 9-month period. And in between, we put some of them through a mental health intervention to see, with a control group, to see if the reduction in symptoms of complex PTSD leads to an improvement of all of these different measures that are related to violent conflict. There's a model there of how we're going to be looking at it. And so we have some preliminary findings I can share with you, because as I said, we're just launching it right now. Some of this findings actually does not come from my work in Accept. It comes with another organization called the Global Strategy Network. So for example, I was doing research in Al-Hol, and with ISIS returnees in northeast Syria. Al-Hol is this huge detention center. There's something like 80,000 people who are in the detention center. There's parts of it that are basically being controlled by ISIS and ISIS militia over there. You have about 20,000 kids who are essentially orphans living in this camp. Many of them are, at this point, almost becoming like feral children. You hear reports of kids beating up other kids, raping other children, gangs of women coming over and beating the kids who raped the children with iron rods. It's really a terrible situation when you hear what's happening over there. ISIS are walking around with semi-automatic weapons within the detention center. There's something like, sometimes it's 2 murders a day, sometimes it's 2 murders a week, but it just goes to show you just sort of how terrible that situation is. So there was about 160 people that so I did a bunch of interviews and focus groups, but then about 160 people I looked at who had come out of the camp and were trying to reintegrate back into their towns in northeast Syria. And so I did surveys with those people, and it was a control. There was the actual ISIS returnees in Syria who I surveyed across a variety of mental health issues and different measures related to extremism. And then there was a control group of people who had lived in northeast Syria but themselves had never joined ISIS. So we knew in the data set who was a member of ISIS and who was not, who never joined ISIS, but they all lived together basically in northeast Syria. So some of them joined, some of them didn't join. And we want to see from these measures that we had, could we be able to then detect in a blinded way who actually joined ISIS and who didn't join ISIS, basically using different AI techniques. And the 2 measures that came out the highest for being able to predict ISIS membership was what's called high adverse childhood experiences. So these are things like child abuse, so they can be even bullying from peer to peers, but they're not the kind of normal things that maybe many of us have that maybe mess us up later on in our lives. this is some pretty drastic stuff. This is sexual abuse, physical abuse, living at home with parents who are addicted to drugs or alcohol, total absentee parenting, severe bullying by peers. So we find that high adverse childhood experiences plus having low social capital were the two best predictors of whether someone ended up joining ISIS or not from the area of northeast Syria. So already you're seeing sort of the psychological, the individual variable with the high ACE, and then the sociological factor of the low social capital, not being able to. People who had high ACE but high social capital later on were much more resilient to getting pulled into extremist organizations. We have a partner in Iraq and northeast Syria called Beyond Conflict that has also been doing their own research on interventions to see if they can reduce traumatic symptoms. How will that reduce various outgroup tensions, outgroup anxieties, desire for outgroup conflict? They've done their own randomized control trial studies, and we'll be doing ours with them. And their technique is very interesting because it's a mixture of mindfulness, somatic exercises, and narrative discussion, which leads to reduced complex PTSD, and then that leads to reduced outgroup tensions. Now, mindfulness is very interesting because it's a term that's thrown around a lot. People are very interested in it. The way that they can't actually call it mindfulness when they go into, the Muslim world. People say that's shirk. That's this weird Eastern Buddhist religion. We don't want to actually do any of that. So they have to actually do mindfulness exercises without really calling them mindfulness exercises, essentially. And so a lot of what that basically does is come back to the moment. Don't get lost in your own thought. Being able to dissociate to stop identifying with the thoughts that you're having, essentially. You're always going to have the thoughts, and the depressive thoughts, and the anxious thoughts, and people will continue to have all of those things. But the mindfulness is to no longer identify and say, those thoughts are me, and to create that disconnection. And if you go fully into mindfulness, it does increase compassion, empathy, and a sense of non-separateness between people. And those are slowly the kinds of exercises that take place in the intervention. There's also somatic exercises to deal with the panic attacks themselves. Focus on your breathing, focus on where you are right now, touch your own hands. And then there's narrative discussions. People, especially in that part of the world, don't want to talk about their mental health issues. It's very difficult to get them to open up and talk about their depression and anxiety and so forth. So what they oftentimes do is they take little vignettes of people whose lives are kind of similar to them, like almost like cartoon characters or like short stories. And then they'll have people discuss those vignettes and discuss those stories and talk through the different kinds of problems. Muhammad was from northeast Syria and he ended up in the camp and he had these experiences, and then there was a discussion about these fictional characters. And through the discussion of these fictional characters, they're able to basically start to talk about some of their own mental health issues and work through it. And when they combine all of these different things, mindfulness, somatic exercises, and narrative discussions, they find not only reduced complex PTSD, but it's the first that I know of intervention that also leads to reduced outgroup tensions as well. Now, they didn't look at things like violent extremism. It was more about sectarianism and more about willingness to engage with the outgroup. So we're going to go a little bit further and bring in measures related to violence. And so now the big question, of course, after hearing all this is, what is the underlying psychological mechanisms here that are really at play that can maybe that are not only related to reduction in violent extremism, but may be connected to everything that we've been discussing for the last couple days here, right? We talked, it came up, the ideas about our concerns about misinformation and disinformation, information wars, conspiracy theory, extremist beliefs. So one thing, and I think there's a connection between all this stuff on mental health and trauma and that. So one thing that we know about complex PTSD is that it leads to a chronic threat detection or uncertainty intolerance, right? When you have again and again these terrible experiences that have happened to you, you go through the world with a heightened threat detection. You see threat in all sorts of places. And that can make you feel very vulnerable, feel very unsafe. And that is exactly where a group with high entitativity, a group with clear in-group and out-group boundaries, clear sacred values and identities, clear goals, as well as a very coherent and simple narrative that allows you to tie all the different threats that you're having into one coherent threat. and simplifying the complexity of the world into a more clear us versus them narrative. And that's what you see with QAnon, what I see in my interviews with QAnon, it's what you see with white nationalists, it's what you see with jihadists again and again. So it seems that it helps people actually. That's the funny thing, is when I'm telling people, when someone has these mental health issues and they're joining an extremist group, and you're saying you shouldn't be joining this group or we should be pulling them out of it, I'm saying, but what are you replacing it with? It's actually helping them. Their symptoms are actually reducing once they actually join the group. Their threat detection goes down, their complex PTSD symptoms start to go down once they're part of the actual group, because now they have a brotherhood and sisterhood. Now they feel a little bit more safe, they're part of the tribe. Now they have a coherent worldview where they don't have all these disparate threats all over, but it's just one clear threat. And you're now part of this motivated group of devoted actors who are going to work together in using collective action to go fight against that threat. So again, it makes people feel safe. It helps them with a lot of their mental health issues. Now, when you start to improve these symptoms of complex PTSD, you start to lower people's threat detection and increase their uncertainty tolerance, their ability to deal with the complexity of the world of black and white. What you find is that you have increased possibilities for perspective taking, for metacognition, for empathy, for compassion. And this is obviously a little bit confounded because most of the studies are using mindfulness, which is explicitly trying to enhance some of these very qualities in people. And so, and I guess this is almost going to go back to my talk from last year a little bit, which is, so much of what we've done in Western society and in the post-Enlightenment is to try to increase our analytic capacities, right? To make ourselves smarter, more rational, more logical in our thinking. A very left brain sort of mindset. But of course, as I brought up, and as the studies from here, from Oxford and other places have shown, the people who are amongst educated people, the degree you find most often found, most prevalent in terrorist groups are people with engineering degrees. So it's not that these people are all stupid individuals. These are some of the smartest people that we're producing with advanced engineering degrees, and you also see people with high analytic thinking. That's more for white nationalists, who rank very high in analytic thinking as opposed to holistic thinking, who get pulled into many of these groups. And so much of what mindfulness, and I think what a lot of different Eastern practices do focus on, is this more right brain activation and right brain cultivation, what we would call non-cognitive skills. So most of our education in the West is focused on cognitive skills, knowledge, reasoning, math, science. That's what I studied growing up, that's what most of us study, and that's what a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers themselves thought. This is how we can make a democracy work. This is how we can have more pluralistic societies, if we just improve people's cognitive skills. But when you look at this research, and you look at other broader research, you have to start to question that. Because there are people with very sophisticated cognitive skills who are going down this path of conspiracy theories and believing in misinformation, disinformation, who are joining terrorist groups. Clearly, that can't be where the issue is. And I would argue, and I think this evidence that we're beginning to collect and we have collected will give more credence to this claim, which is that we should be focusing, I think, more on the non-cognitive skills of our human psychology, which is more of the right brain, which is more holistic thinking, which is more emotional cultivations related to empathy and compassion and perspective taking. And ultimately being able to handle and deal and live with uncertainty in our day-to-day lives. I think if we can do that, and we can increase that capacity within society, not only will you reduce the rate at which people may get pulled into violent extremist groups, I actually just think it'll be good for the future of liberal democracy, especially in the cyber warfare, information warfare society that we already are in, and we're going to be increasingly finding ourselves in. So I'll stop.
Thanks very much indeed, Nafees. And there are a number of comments that I'd like to make, or questions I'd like to pick up myself. But first of all, I'd like to open the floor to other colleagues, and I'm sure some people have questions which you want to clarify or whatever. So let's say Yasmin, Manas, and Darius.
Thanks, that was really, really interesting. Just a question, have you been looking at, or could you look at changes in the use of language and language patterns? Just in framing the way we talk.
Yes, that's fascinating. That's exactly what we're hoping to do in Syria, because while they're going through the intervention, we'll be doing a lot of written exercises. And so we'll be able to see how they're changing their language. And there's one study that showed that as people's complex PTSD lowered, they switched from using I language to we language a lot more. And that's interesting, and I mean, there's different possible interpretations of what that means. One possible interpretation is that, again, it goes back to that sense of non-separateness that people start to feel, which I think is a big part of what mindfulness exercise tries to get you
Well,
towards.
it's interesting because I did some stuff very early on, looking at the youth and Bradford and places like that. And there was a transition from I to we, because they were recruiting what was happening in the Islamic world to what they were feeling, and they moved from I to we.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's interesting.
Well, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. It's an area that is much needed to have more research on, especially around these children who are, they have experienced trauma at a young age. Their parents have experienced trauma because of war, because of the journey, because of violence. The only thing I would like to see is some results, because this has been happening for a long time, and it's been addressed in several, as we say, UN humanitarian intervention, preparedness, and we can talk about trauma, but the money that goes towards the healing or the programs to tackle mental health issues and trauma for these kids are very, very minimal. These kids are mostly resettled, let's say, or they go back to their societies, and as we all know, they are the future of the society, so we can only think of the quality that will come out of that. There's a correction comment I wanted to say about El Hol. The area there is a camp, and it's very disputed character. It's a detention facility because most of them are women and children, elderly, of ISIS fighters' family members. They're not Syrian returnees. The percentage of Syrians there are low. The person, for example, Shamima is there, so she's not Syrian, but many of ISIS fighters' family members from various parts of the world are there, and they have the issues of being stripped from nationalities or being under trial. So it is kind of like a peculiar place under control of Kurdish militia, separatists, like they want that part of Syria for themselves and supported by various political entities. So the place there is a time bomb, and nobody seems to be looking at it, and even vocabulary around it is a little bit mixed up. So I'm very happy you are able to access that and do some research, and maybe we can talk about it later.
Absolutely, thank you. And yeah, I didn't mean people to think that the 80,000 people who were in Al Hol are all Syrians, but the people who I did the study with were all Syrians. They were mostly from the Raqqa area. They were held in Al Hol for many years, and they had just been reintegrated back into the area in and around Raqqa. And so it was a comparison between these people who had joined, who were from the area, and many of their neighbors who also lived through the same period but never joined.
Yes.
So that's what that study was about.
Very interesting.
Darish, I can see we have a question from Raja online here, and then please.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and deep insight. I would like to comment that that's a small point that probably now we should, with a research of that kind, move our attention also on Ukraine and Poland. Through Polish border entered 5 million migrants from Ukraine in last half a year, and we have in Poland more than a million, roughly speaking, kids with PTSD problems. All of those families were welcome to the houses. There is no migrant camp in Poland having 2 million Ukrainians here. But probably the knowledge you've got may be of an extreme importance in Poland, because people face a problem with those new guests. I mean, the kids are jumping under a car when they see a plane. That's the reality in Poland. More than a million kids in that state. So I'll be very interested in discussion after that, because the foundation I run is working also with Ukrainian kids. We open 60 places for Ukrainian kids in Poland, and your experience is extremely needed there.
Let's take the rest of the questions and then I'll let you respond, and then there's a couple of comments I want to make. So Raja has asked, thank you, could you elaborate what narrative discussions entail? So if you can pick that up, perhaps respond, and then Denise. I'm going to have to close down because we've got other comments, and there are some comments I need to make in relation to this.
I just have a very quick question. Do you also consider the collective trauma other than the individual trauma? Because it may have a multiplier effect, or it may reduce the individual trauma, maybe if it is shared by the other people. Maybe it can make a difference.
And a very quick comment actually related to both what you were saying, she was looking at you. I had the chance of visiting Elbow twice, and then in one of the, in the first visit that I had there, I had come across a lady. She was about 28, 29, I mean less than 30. And she was actually talking exactly about what you said about the alternative. So she was saying that the whole idea of turning from nobody to somebody by joining these groups is something that I cannot find anywhere else. So what do you expect me to do? So if that much of a problem that like that, from exactly that's what she said, from nobody I turn to somebody. So do you have any other alternative for me to do this kind of thing? So thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so narrative discussions was, what I meant by that was the vignettes that I was describing, basically, these fictional stories that you come up with so people can talk about their own problems essentially through fictional characters, short stories and so forth. So they talk about these characters and they end up inadvertently sort of talking about their own issues. In terms of what you're talking about, yes, we're absolutely looking at intergenerational trauma and memorialization of trauma, collective narratives. What's interesting is actually that social, so if you compare like two areas where there was maybe some traumatic experience happen, whether it was ISIS or whether it was some coalition bombs that dropped, where you find, again, very low social cohesion, you see a lot of trauma showing up in those areas. But areas with this high social cohesion, you have PTSD, but you don't see complex PTSD showing up. So it does show that things like high social cohesion can actually buffer the PTSD from turning into this more insidious version of itself.
Let me pick up a couple of things here, because I find even with many of my psychiatric colleagues, that there's a lack of clarity which can be extremely damaging. When people fall mentally ill, they are responding inappropriately and in an exaggerated way to whatever experiences they have. What you're describing is appropriate reactions to an inappropriate situation that they're bringing. And let me give you an example of why this is appropriate. So for example, somebody starts to suffer from depression and they've just been bereaved of their spouse. This is not inappropriate. Somebody suddenly starts to suffer from depression and there's no such thing as happened, or the budgie died last week and they went into profound depression. There's something inappropriate about that. There's something exaggerated about that. So I get a little uneasy when people start talking about mental health problems, because what that does is confuse these two things. Now let me give you an example of why this is a real problem. Some years ago I was asked to go to the Northern Ireland Hospice, which is a place where people come in for their last few weeks before they die, usually from cancer. And it was breaking down. There were huge, there were all sorts of, there was illness, there was rows with the management, there were all sorts of problems were emerging. And they called in a psychologist, and it made everything much worse. And they asked me if I would come and see what was happening. And so I started to see the staff, all the staff, in little groups of 6 or 7. And what became very clear was that this psychologist was assuming that these people were particularly vulnerable because of their background and their experience and so on and so on. And so the message to people was, we need to look at your problems. And all that did was make things worse, because that wasn't the problem. The problem is that when you're working in a hospice, people come in, they're at the extreme part of life, you fashion instinctively, because it's the reason you're there, a very powerful emotional bond with these people. And they die. They all die. It's not like in a hospital where some die and some get better. Every one of those people who comes into a hospice is coming in to die. So you have a very intense emotional experience, and then they die. And then before the bed gets cool, there's another person in, and you do the same again, and again, and again, and again. And it's the equivalent of March fractures. March fractures were in the First World War. Soldiers were wearing these really heavy rucksacks, carrying far too heavy things, that their legs and bones were not constructed to cope with. And so they kept, their bones kept fracturing and crumbling and so on. Not because they had particular vulnerabilities, but because inappropriate pressure was being put on. And this is a really important point, because when I started saying to the staff and to the management, this kind of experience going on for more than about 3 years is not what we were constructed as human beings to cope with. There are the odd people that can do it, but the majority can't. So please give time-limited 3-year contracts, because people will try to stay doing this work even when it's damaging them, because everybody outside looks at it and says, this is wonderful work and you're doing marvellous things, and so it's a kind of gilded cage. And so what they had to start doing was saying, you can come and work here for 3 years, but after that you either go and do work somewhere else, or you move from patient care to management or teaching or working in the community or something of that kind. Now the problem I have with looking at these kinds of things is that when we talk about it as mental health problems, people start to assume that there's something inappropriate about it. And there are 2 or 3 ways in which that's a problem. The first is the notion that terrorism is an inappropriate reaction. Terrorism is frequently an appropriate reaction to a situation that cannot be changed in any other non-violent way for a minority of people, and there is no alternative for them but to do that, because they're not put in a position where the change can be made peacefully. Why? Because the other people don't want that change to be made. So you take the situation in Northern Ireland, for example. Why was there terrorism? There was terrorism because the politics was set up in such a way that nationalists could not change something that they venomously disagreed with. Why? Because unionists, and to some extent previously the British government, were saying, no, we have the power and we're going to keep it in this kind of way. Once you opened a door that said, okay, we can change the politics, do you have a future possibility of doing it without violence? There's no need for the violence. But then what happens, say it quietly, is exactly what the unionists feared. It will actually move eventually to a united Ireland, which is what they didn't want, what they were trying to prevent. And in an awful lot of these situations where there's terrorism, for example in the Middle East, it's because external forces are trying to maintain a situation that some of the people there don't want. They have no other democratic way of changing it, and therefore they resort to violence. For that to always be regarded as pathological is actually deceiving ourselves. And it's true also of some people, for example, on the white right. If you ask people on the white right in America, what are they worried about? They're worried about changes in culture which are taking place. It's not a fantasy. These are actual realities. And so what they're experiencing as trauma is not mental illness. It's not even mental illness for a group. It's actually a realization that something has happened which they don't like. Other people may like it. That means that you've got a problem of no agreement on what is the good thing. And that's where we get into a problem. Now, a couple of other things to just mention in passing. When I was working as a psychiatrist, I was working with individual people. Okay. First thing is, we are not at all sure how to deal with the ongoing results of trauma. We're not at all sure about that. You get some people who will just get better anyway. Other people will get better after a while. Other people will not get better no matter what you do. Other people will break down with physical illnesses instead of mental disturbances of various kinds. Second thing is, I went out to Colombia. We are talking there about 7 million victims over a period of 40 years. You cannot do, even if you find successful ways of dealing with individuals, you can't apply them to the group situation. You've got to begin to think, how do we deal with this at the level of the large group? And again, that's something we're only really beginning to explore. Then you go into situations like this, where the trauma hasn't stopped. That's a different situation again. And
And I think there's a real question as to how much you can actually successfully do about the trauma when the trauma is continuing on. Do you have the possibility or capacity to make the sort of changes that might give the person some chance of relief, or the whole community some chance of relief? So I flag up those things because I think they are really crucial if we're actually going to understand what's going on, rather than simply mollify our own unease at what's happening. And some of these things are not easily solvable. So I think it's really important that you're doing the work and exploring it. But I think it's also important to take these kinds of elements into the consideration.
No, I 100% agree. I mean, when it comes to it is at the systemic level that we need to be solving many of these problems. Well, at the same time, I still think I'm very appreciative of work like Beyond Conflict and other people who are going in there and providing some of these interventions and treatments. Because you do see individual variability. Some people go through the exact same experiences and don't develop any of these symptoms. Other people develop a lot of the symptoms. Some people respond very well to the treatment and their lives are a lot better. And they do become less susceptible to some of these joining some of these extremist groups.
So the thing that's important is not pathologizing it.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I find to be a danger, that people think about it as though this was a pathological reaction, when it's a normal reaction to a pathological situation.
Yeah, and that's a note for me on how I communicate this, right? Because the findings are the findings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. But if you think that this is somebody suffering from a disorder, if you think about it and you respond to it in a very different way than you think it, this is a not inappropriate response to a disorder situation.
Yeah.
And that provokes you to think in a different way. Final question from the side.
John, this is outside of my field, but there are publications coming out that mushrooms, one-time mushroom experience is curing PTSD significantly. I think we should really get these people to cultivate and consume these mushrooms. Because if the goal is mindfulness, it's not a bad idea for them to cultivate and consume this drug, which is natural, and if it's harmless.
Right. Well, the thing that's important about this is since the Enlightenment, the view has been that you find these things out by separating the physical from the mental. That these are two separate things that don't engage with each other at all.
Yeah, but there's pharmacology, right? A entire field of pharmacology that deals with mental disease.
Hang on until I finish the sentence. What has become clear in the last period of time is these are not separate issues at all. Not separate at all. So when something happens to you psychologically, there is some kind of connection. It's not the same thing. There is some kind of connection with your biology. And this is one of the things that a psychiatrist finds. Psychologists can stick to the psychological, biologists can stick to the biological. But when you're trying to say, well, wait a minute, let's try to understand this person, let's understand me, then something is emerging, and this is where complexity is important, something is emerging from the biological, which is not wholly separate from it, and is not bounded by it. So for example, if you take Freud's view was that he had to work with the psychological because the organic was too difficult, but that there would be a time whenever the organic would actually help us to take the psychological forward in a new way. And I think we're at the point where that's beginning to become possible. And sometimes it's necessary to have both of these. So for example, when somebody's really disturbed, you need the pharmacology to calm them down sufficiently to engage psychologically with them. The calming down on its own doesn't work, the psychological on its own doesn't work, but when you work with the two of them together, you can sometimes get something, which is the opposite of what both psychological and biological psychiatrists thought 30 years ago. So I think you point out a really important aspect of things, and maybe that's something that we may be able to pick up at a future quick meeting, either on our annual conferences or a separate one. Quick comment, Liz, before we move on to
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I missed most of your presentation, and you may well have said this, but just to feed in something from the South African experience. In 1994, we had people from the Swedish Fire Brigade who came actually to help to set up our radio communications. But what they did as well was to speak very keenly about trauma counselling. And they had a European pattern. It was done individually. That didn't work, people didn't want it. But when people started getting people in the townships, teachers and others in groups to share what they had experienced, that did help. So in that culture, it's usually most important to do your therapy with people in groups together, rather than individually.
Well, that's one of the things that we were speaking about earlier on, absolutely, absolutely.
Nafees, thank you very much.